joke I always had is the people in the back, no, I can't hear you. And then I'd always say, well, how can you answer the question? But anyway, delighted to be here. We'll wait just a couple minutes. We got a couple people still rolling in. By the way, before we get started, I just wanted to mention to you that this is a CompTIA Plus approved course for continuing education credit. So I don't know if anybody's going to be here, but if you're here the whole time, I don't bore you to death, you can get that credit for this time slot. Oh, there is a scanner in the back of the room? Oh, there it is, right on the corner there. Hey, thank you very much.
But it doesn't kick in until like I think an hour after the classes start. So people have to sit in here.
They want you to stay here, right? So I gotcha. Yeah. FYI, if you want credit, you got to be here to the bitter end, right? Or I'll have everybody go out, and then 5 minutes before it's over, they'll come back in and okay. Anyway. Hopefully we'll find this informative for you. Well, why don't we get started? First of all, my name is Bob Bauman. I have a company called Trusted Systems. And you can tell by the white hair I've been around a while. Actually started the company about 35 years ago, getting into trying to figure out how physical security and what they called InfoSec back then interacted with each other. It's now cybersecurity. Of course, they changed the names to protect the innocent. But as things and technology has evolved, there has been an increasing concern about insider threats, and we're going to get into this in detail, but what we're going to talk about today is fundamentally how to secure SIPRnet nodes. Because they talk about cybersecurity all the time, but there is a very, very important physical security component that DISA is now starting to get very active in enforcing. They have these little things called STIGs, and annually you have your CCRIs. And we're going to talk about how to mitigate that and how to resolve it, but yet also how to secure the endpoint. And we're going to look at it as kind of a holistic piece, not just a physical security or not just OPSEC or other things, but looking at it as a whole and how we can actually have better protection, but also gives you some mobility as well. Now, a couple of comparisons here. Cybersecurity works from the inside out. It's through the network. It is looking for bad actors or looking for things to go wrong, but it's from the inside out. And the physical security side is from the outside in. But the problem is that physical security stops at the wall. What do I mean by that? You've got a gap. When you look at a SCIF, you look at a CAA, you look at a closed area, all the security that's physical stops at the lock at the door and at the wall. It doesn't look inside. It doesn't look at the gap between the wall and the desktop. And because of that, your network equipment is left vulnerable. SCIFs protect space, not equipment. And that's a problem. And because of that, the policies also stop at the wall. And they don't address what goes on between the wall and the desktop, and particularly on the desktop with the user. and how he interacts with the network. And so this is where the insider threat has evolved. And as the bigger the network gets, the more users you have, the more threat vectors you have, you get guys like Bradley, now Chelsea Manning, and Edward Snowden. Perfectly cleared people in a perfectly cleared skiff. You know, all the protocols were met, except you had a bad actor. And because they were in that skiff, and because they assumed once they were in, everything was fair game, the network equipment and the portal to the network became a vulnerability. Now, in looking at the risk associated with this, you have two aspects to risk. One is likelihood and the other is consequence. Now, the likelihood is one now that's exploding because of the number of access points. As SIPRNet expands out, in particular, we'll be targeting SIPRNet for this discussion. You have an explosion of users out there, and every endpoint becomes a threat vector because it exposes the entire network, and that's the consequence. And so as it expands, your likelihood is expanding, and the consequence of something going wrong also expands because you also have exposure because you're distributing and you're dealing with more data. So you have a bigger database that's vulnerable because every endpoint has access to every other endpoint, as well as to the data centers and the servers and all the data that it contains. So it's kind of an exponential growth in the threat. The other side of it, and I'm kind of an old-time guy, I'm a hardware kind of guy, but when you start looking at networking and cybersecurity, the game is the intelligence of the network can always be used against itself. So the smarter you get, the smarter the bad guys get. The more you put in defenses and viruses or antiviral protection, the more they come up with a new virus, or they come up with a new malware, or they come up with something different. And that has created an issue, whereas what happened with Edward Snowden, because I know I lost my clearance as a result, because they started tightening down and they started to scrutinize the clearances, and also they started to tighten the CCRIs in terms of who had access to what. So they're looking at USB ports and they're looking at where those threat vectors are. But that doesn't tell the whole story. That's really just putting a Band-Aid on it. And so what we started to do and what I want to talk about today, so I want to kind of break down the differences between the two cultures of IT security, however you want to label it, cybersecurity, and physical security. Because they have always been at odds with each other. So when I looked at it, over the years, I've come up with the acronym G3D as compared to C4I. G3D is guns, gates, guards, and dogs, okay? And that's the mentality of what you're dealing with in the physical security world, and it hasn't changed much. Whereas in C4I, you're in a totally different environment. One is very dynamic, moving ahead with technology, and the other is very static. It's the building, it's the facility. They don't want it to change. They don't want anything to be different at all. So one is driven by its facility, and the other is driven by technology. And the fact that, well, they move at the speed of a glacier or they move at the speed of light. So physical security has always had a very tough time keeping up with technology. And it's an ongoing battle. Now, the other aspect of it is that physical security is tangible, touchy-feely. I want to have some tires to kick. Whereas in the IT world, it's all virtual. Drives physical security people crazy because they can't touch it. It's somewhere in the ether, it's in the cloud. And so these issues help to define the disparity between the two. The other aspect is that physical security always maintains things being offline. It's not a network, it is a storage kind of environment. You got to take it, you got to unplug it, you got to remove a hard drive, you got to remove a laptop, and you got to put it somewhere and keep it in cold storage. Then the physical guy has that comfort zone of knowing that, well, I know where that drive is, and I know it's in that safe. Whereas in a networked, real-time environment, everything is online. And when you start look at the dependence that we have on networking now, and the dependence for command and control and logistics and everything else that we have on real-time availability of data, and the aspect that you have to make decisions, and all the command and control is now dependent on that availability of data, because it's now an information-based decision making. It's not the physical environment. So one basically limits access, the other expands it. Now, because of that, when we look at the convergence at the endpoint, we're looking at different kinds of security. It's a multifaceted thing. I said that a little bit earlier. You have physical security, you have OPSEC, you have COMSEC. That's been the traditional physical security environment that's been there forever. And then it merged into InfoSec environment, MSEC, emanation security, that's Tempest and everything related to emanations, and now cybersecurity, or I shortened it to cybersec. But the problem is we need to look, when we start looking at the endpoint, where the user and where the network is most vulnerable, I've kind of coined the phrase EndSec. And so we're going to kind of focus on this as a combination of all the other secs put together. Now, when you look at trying to be secure at the endpoint, you have to look at security in depth. Because it's not just cyber, it's not just physical, it's not just OPSEC, it's combinations or interactions between them. So you have the typical kinetic attack, or the denial of service threat, where you just can cut the power or you can cut things off to a network. You also have manipulation, theft, damage that you want to invoke, where you're actually trying to change the integrity of the data itself. You obviously have the emanation security, and one little word that's kind of been added in there that has become more and more important is EMP, electromagnetic pulse. Are you all familiar with what that is? Need some heads nodding, good. Okay, because EMP is now starting to become a threat vector to our power grid, as well as to integrity of network equipment, because it can fry it in a nanosecond or two. But with emanations, you also have another thing that's rearing its ugly head, and that is in the cellular world. And you know that you have to park your cell phones before you go into a secured area, and I have to manage all that. So between Wi-Fi, what's been involved, in fact, even with the CSFC and some of that activity, and then you start working into the cellular world, these are all vulnerabilities that exist. Of course, the traditional cyber attacks, insider, outsider threats, and then the other threats which you can't control is from natural disaster, power outage, or inadvertent human error, which could be overt or covert or incidental. But what's happened is these threats are constantly changing because of technology and because of the adversaries. Now,
concerning Wi-Fi or cellular, so why do we have to keep our cell phones outside of the zipper?
Well, as a matter of fact, what can happen is if you are on a zipper circuit and your monitor and keyboard are emitting signals, they can be captured by the transmit circuit on your cell phone and actually captured and sent out to an outside source. outside of that cleared area.
Okay, that has to be a special created cell phone though, or they can go down.
Well, it can be, but then you don't know what's in what cell phone. With the technology that's evolving, everybody's listening to everybody else. You know, if you look at some of the things that Google and Facebook and others are doing, where they're listening to everything that's going on, and you just don't know it. But that's the threat.
That would only be if you have a wireless keyboard and mouse, right?
That would be more prominent at that, but you see your monitor emits all by itself. And unless it's a tempested monitor, it can emit a signal, and the sensitivity of cell phones now to capture this data is now getting so powerful that you can have the ability of doing it. Now, one thing I should point out here is this is a guessing game, okay? Security, you have to understand, is a perception. Because a lot of times, the reality of someone getting into a general's office and having a cell phone there that they're going to capture data and that he's going to be in the middle of activity, the likelihood of that, we talk about consequence and likelihood, the likelihood of those events are very, very rare because you have to kind of thread a bunch of needles in order to get to that point to make it that vulnerable. But the real issue is one of playing the odds, of you want to put these barriers in place so that you don't have to worry about it. And this has always been a problem, particularly in the physical security world, because they just have a physical barrier and they figure, okay, I'm safe behind the wall, no problem at all. But when you get into cyber, when you get into cell phones, when you get to emanations, it's all around you and you don't know what's there. You don't know if someone's looking at the camera on your laptop or capturing data from some other means that you can't even detect. But we got to deal with the probability of what we can control here and now. And that's what we're going to focus on here today. With cybersecurity, it works through the network. Obviously, physical security works around it. Cybersecurity is also reactive. When you're dealing with intelligence, you're kind of guessing what's going to happen next. I kind of label it cyber chess, because you're trying to anticipate the next 3 or 4 moves on down to how they're going to react, but you don't know, because they're doing the same thing to you. Whereas with physical security, it can be proactive. You can overtly channel people to behave or to perform in a certain way that eliminates any of these uncertainties. But they have to work together. And that's the important thing. Now, heart of the problem. You can't use the word always very often. But when it comes to security, it's always a people problem. And it's either the users, or it's techs, or it's guards, or it's people inspecting things, or whatever you have. All these things that are put in place, when they get manpower intensive, it's always getting back to how do you solve the people problem? Because that's the risk, whether it's a general or whether it's a private. Whether it's Bradley, now Chelsea Manning, sitting out in a tent in Afghanistan going after State Department data, where his only security in a JWIC circuit happens to be some guards walking around the tent, or you're in a general officer quarters and he's doing email at night by himself. The problem is the people are the main issue. And because their greatest vulnerability is at the endpoint, that's why we focus there. And why we require proactive access controls along with physical security to give you the best chance of protecting that network access. Now, since I have a lot more history than anybody else in here, I want to go back and give a little bit of historical reference, because there are a couple of things that have changed along the way that are dramatic paradigm shifts that we need to think about. Happened around 1990. And that was when, prior to that time, a few of us may remember when batch processing was the norm, a SCIF was fine because everything occurred in one room. You had no I/O, you had no network. Everything prior to that was done centrally batched. You got punch cards going in, you got a printout coming out, and that's how you did data processing. But from the mid-'80s, when microcomputers came into being, companies like, in fact, my background is with Sun Microsystems in the early days. I was their VAR number 4, and which I know dates myself. But anyway, their advertisement was, the network is the computer. And so you're now taking the database and you don't have it in one spot that you can secure and you know it's there. You now have it everywhere. Every endpoint has their own hard drive, has their own, from mini computers to microcomputers to laptops, wherever we are today, to even your iPhones. You now have distributed data storage. And how do you physically protect that? And that becomes a real issue. So around 1990, there was a tremendous shift in how information was perceived and managed. And it became a distributed communications issue rather than a processing data storage issue. And that was a big change. So what happened then? Well, first of all, we had the internet, which kind of gave you the vehicle to allow this tremendous expansion and distributed computing. You also had the wall coming down, and we also went from an asymmetric threat, or a symmetric threat in a sense, the bipolar, us against the Soviets kind of thing. It now exploded to everything. But something else happened then. And this is a very, very key point that I want you to take away from this. The definition of a SCIF changed. It used to be a secured facility, sensitive compartmented information facility, which meant everything was encased within that facility. The whole ballgame changed when you went to distributed computing because now it became a network portal. So it was just an endpoint that was accessing a network. Edward Snowden had the world as his oyster, including Fort Meade when he was sitting out here in a cave, because the SCIF he was in that everyone thought was secure, the guy who they thought was cleared, had access to everything else on the network and was able to rob Fort Meade blind. And that's because the whole concept from a physical security point of view of it being a network portal was never taken into account. The same specs still apply before 1990 as they do now. So this is a very important point that I want you to remember, because now the security wasn't based in the SCIF. It had to be pushed to the endpoint. From that point, you also had to deal with, as the networks grew, the vulnerabilities grew, but the problem is the policy was left unchanged. What they call the ICD 706, the SCIF policy hasn't changed, hardly at all. And the interesting thing is the endpoint hasn't changed all that much. Technology has changed. You have a different monitor. You have a flat panel, flat screen instead of a CRT tube or a printer. You have all kinds of other technological interfaces, but the user interface is the same. I did a study. There's a guy named Hall and Stephenson in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the wonderful year of 1887. I was just a kid then. But 1887 was when he invented the QWERTY keyboard that became the first typewriter. That hasn't changed. We're still dealing with that same user interface. And so it's the man-machine interface, and that user interface is what we have to manage and we have to secure. And it's not just physical security, it's not just cyber, it's an all of the above approach. What we've added is, of course, you can add VTC terminals, you can add different multimedia environments, voice over IP phones and things of that sort. But that's pretty much the world that we are in. And those are the changes that have affected from then until now. So when we look at the endpoint, there are several objectives. One is you want to secure the network hardware, not the space. Number two is you want to focus on online security rather than offline storage, because every time you go offline, you now have to reboot. You don't know where the data is. You may know it's in a safe, but it's got to get from one place to the other. But it becomes disjointed from the network. So real-time availability of data, when you have to get it, you have to have it now, you don't, because you have to go through a reboot cycle. You have to restabilize the network. That has to be changed. The other thing is, you don't want to tie yourself to the facility. GSA, I think, has something like umpteen million square feet of office space, and they've got several million SCIFs that are sitting out there unused because they were built out and then people had to move. So because the security was tied to the building and not to the network, you now had to give that up and rebuild it somewhere else. We can't afford to do that anymore. The other thing is, it needs to be seamless. It's got to go from your lovely little QWERTY keyboard all the way to the network. It can't just go from the wall. And the whole point is, if you're distributing the data, you're distributing the security, you want to bring the security to you at your desktop instead of making you go to the security or go to the network. And this makes it a much more contiguous online process that if you can manage it well, that you can make things work. The traditional things we know about. The SCIF, CAA, cleared access areas, open storage sites, they only secure space. They don't touch any equipment at all. When you add PDS into the equation, which is a protective distribution system, that's just the conduit that connects secure enclaves to each other. Big problem with that is it's fixed. Once it's in place, you can't change it and move it. You're dealing with a Dropbox on the wall, and that's where you're going to connect to the network. So it's tied to the building. And the problem is you've got red signals now flying all around the facility. So it has to be inspected sometimes twice a day, at least once a day. And you don't have people. Again, it's a manpower problem. You don't have people to do it. The third is, for offline storage, they had always relied on the good old GSA storage containers. And that creates a problem, as I've described before, of you're now taking the data offline, and it's not accessible when and where you need it. So, with all this in place, this poor little endpoint has been ignored because they're using the traditional view of things to see what would work. This is a typical environment. And one of the things I wanted to, let's see if this works here. Nope, guess not. But if you look on the right side, or the left side to you guys, nope, right to you guys, left to me. All the devices that you have at the desktop now can be for online, offline storage. You have Dropboxes, you have all kinds of devices, as well as safes, plus the PDS in the middle. Managing that is a nightmare. We can't afford to do it any longer. So, we now have conflicting requirements when it comes to CIPRNet. DISA is now tightening up with their STIGs and your annual CCRIs. It used to be called the DICAP, it's now the CCRI. And the whole criteria is trying to tighten this down and come up with a sensible solution. The policy people at DoD themselves haven't been very proactive when it comes to SCIFs and it comes to physical security. But DISA, who owns and manages CyberNet, has been very proactive in that area. Now, what they've done is they're trying to reduce the dependence on PDS, make things more autonomous and self-supporting, which means what they do is they push encryption as far to the endpoint as they can. Why? Because now you have encrypted data as close to the user as possible, and you don't have PDS to have to deal with connecting from point to point. That's all red data that is, in fact, vulnerable. Now, the other thing that is kind of conflicting is that the user access to network devices is becoming a concern. And they have a STIG, and I'll point it out in a minute, that says only authorized network personnel will have access to network equipment, i.e. users do not. And that creates a bit of a conflict, because if they want instant SIPR access, well, how are they going to open a safe and plug things in when they can't? Or how do they get to the devices that they need to be at? And the other thing that had become a problem is the antiviral software. In fact, it used to be called SIPR Tuesday, where when Microsoft came out with their latest antiviral patches, they would say, hey, we can't deal with this, so you've got to be up to date. Now what DISA is doing is there's now SIPR Tuesdays and Thursdays, because they're only allowing you maybe up to 48 hours before they'll pull you off of the network if you're not compliant. So they're getting much more stringent on what's being done. And this is becoming part of the problem. The current policy, these are what's listed. I won't spend much time on it, because the ICD 705, which is the SCIF spec, is a perimeter document. It's not for the interior. The PDS spec has drop boxes, and you've got the IPS container spec. Now, an IPS container, we're going to talk about that in a minute, because that's part of the solution we're going to be describing, is a storage container that's been made into an armored computer cabinet. But even that spec, the problem is all these policies are disjointed. They don't connect with each other. And that gets the whole siloing, stovepiping effect. With that, what it forces is it forces the local AO, accrediting officer, that has to make a decision of what's compliant and what isn't, and what's acceptable and what's not, because the policy is not that clear. The objectives are, but the policy is not. And so it leaves it open to interpretation. So what they do at one site for the Air Force may not be the same with the Army at another site. Even here on the islands, you can get a wide degree of variety on what's acceptable security policy and what isn't. And that becomes an issue, because the weakest link in the chain is the one that's most vulnerable. And since CyberNet is across the board, anybody can have a vulnerability. Just going to review the DISA STIG here for a minute. This is on information assurance of network connections. They have two checkpoints. This thing I mentioned in an IPS container, which we'll get into detail in a minute, is equivalent now to a CAA, a closed access area. So now you have a self-contained online computer cabinet that can be a CAA by itself, which now gives you the ability of attaching yourself to the network, not to the room. The second one is the one that's gotten a lot of people either in trouble or concerned, and that is that only network administrators have unimpeded access to network devices, switches, routers, crypto gear, storage devices, and the users are not to. They want access to the network, but not the network equipment. The 703 spec, which is the PDS spec, when they talk about the endpoint, the only thing they say is that terminal equipment must be safeguarded to prevent tampering. So what does that mean? That's open to a lot of interpretation as to how do you define tampering. So when you look at something to solve this, you want it to be simple, you want it to be flexible and adaptable, because every network, every endpoint, every one of you on your desktop has a little different environment. You're connecting to different networks, you have different devices you're dealing with, and you have to be flexible to handle that. It needs to be self-contained and modular. It needs to have built-in reliability so that it can stay and operate online all the time, and you're not having to deal with maintenance issues from a hardware point of view. And then, as I mentioned before, you have to have the real-time availability. Plus, it's got to be affordable. SCIFs just aren't affordable anymore. It becomes a real problem. You get up into the JWICS world, it's even worse, because now you have to build a SCIF, and your price of entry is like $500,000 just to get a single JWICS portal. And unless you already have a SCIF, you can't play. So this is becoming a problem where the tail is wagging the dog. The infrastructure, the cost of the build-outs are now dictating where and how you can operate. And that's a problem. So let's talk a little bit about IPS containers. IPS is a GSA-created term called Information Processing System Security Container. And basically what it is it a storage container made into an armored computer cabinet that has its own cooling, its own rack mounting, and a secure way of getting cables in and out, so equipment can run in a closed-door, unattended environment and maintain being online. Because it is a self-contained CAA, it can run closed-door unattended, which means you eliminate the human factor. You eliminate users having to access equipment all the time just to get on and offline. You can have it flexible because you can have different sizes and shapes. And it's adaptable to even existing PDS environments. So there's always the legacy infrastructure you got to deal with, but you got to be both backward looking and forward looking at the same time. And you want to be able to adapt it, say, to higher end environments, maybe putting it into furniture, concealing the fact that a classified presence is there. This is important out at this show because we're dealing with a lot of multinational environments. You're dealing with a combination of SIPRNet and coalition networks. And so you have to coexist. You have to have the ability of compartmentalizing where you need to, but sharing information when you have to. And this becomes a significant criteria that's important. Plus, when you get into the high-end environment, into JWICS in particular, or if you're concerned about an EMP, which we are with Korea certainly, and China, Russia, Iran, you need to have the shielding right. You need to be able to have that level of protection layered in with everything else. So, here's what they look like. There are different sizes and shapes that you have. You have the ability of even integrating in drop boxes so that you can actually have a patch panel on the back of a safe, which allows you to put a switch inside. The user doesn't have access to it, but you can still work in a bullpen environment to be able to connect their copper or fiber into a ongoing network, and then you don't have to get into the safe because you're switching things on and off from the Dropbox. Again, it's a Band-Aid, backward thinking, but it does allow you connectivity going forward. You can put it in furniture, which it is important from the standpoint that it conceals the fact that you have a classified presence. If you're in an overseas foreign environment, foreign nationals, you don't want a safe, gray safe sitting in the corner that has a neon sign on it saying secrets in here. Stupid. Right? But this allows you to also consolidate and centralize your whole comms environment. Because you can have a VTC terminal, voice over IP phone, you can have SIPR, NIPR, you can have coalition, Centrix or whatever, and you can have it all run from one spot. So it consolidates that whole comm center. And then, of course, you can layer in With physical security, you can layer in both an EMP and a Tempest enclosure, which gives you the ability of having a higher level of protection in a high threat environment. Now, compare the two real quick. This is fairly straightforward. SCIFs are fixed, permanent. The IPS containers are self-contained. One protects space, one protects equipment. You also have one as being affordable because of the fact that it's non-obsolescent. You can move it, and whereas a SCIF is not. Once you got it, you're stuck with it. You can't change the size. You can't do anything else with it except use it in its own condition. And that also has to do with the availability that you can manufacture these IPS containers where SCIFs have to be built out. It takes a long time. And the fact that you're also attached to the facility versus being attached to the network. And the amount of human intervention involved in both construction as well as operation and security is all impacted by looking at this kind of a view. The only thing that's different is that the users are inside of a SCIF. So they are controlled, in a sense, because of where they are. And in an IPS container, the users are outside the SCIF. So you have to figure out a way, okay, how do we manage that? And that's what we're going to talk about next. With the physical security, you have a platform that's a foundation, but it doesn't give you access control. It doesn't allow you to control the equipment or the access to the network itself. So because of that, to get an integrated solution, you need access controls. And these proactive access controls need to affect the user interface as well as the network interface. And you combine that together with the protection of this safe. These safes, by the way, the GSA requirement is that they're made out of a steel known as AR500, which, by the way, is the same steel that they make M1 tanks out of. And they did all the up-armoring of Humvees and MRAPs. So the physical security is very robust in these, and it doesn't create a problem for someone trying to break in. But what they are doing is that you're now able to, if you use them with access controls, you can get a seamless protection from the user to the cloud. Now, first one is desktop access control. You now have your normal SIPR token login that works through the typical CAC card that you need, PIN number that you all know and love. What you want is you want the ability of doing it in addition to that to affect the desktop itself, to actually have local access control to turning on the keyboard, monitor, and mouse. Because if everything is kept inside the safe and on and running, you want the ability of toggling those desktop peripherals on and off easily from the desktop. And you want it in addition to your SIPR token. And in fact, you want to make it so that as people are people, they get up and walk away. They don't want to leave the network exposed on the screen. So you want to have a way of a motion sensor or something to actually cut off the circuit, cut off the screen. The network isn't cut off. Because the value of all this is that the network connection is still maintained inside the safe. So all your patches are automatically up to date. Everything is stable and on and running, so you don't have any problems with having to remove hard drives or crypto keys or everything. Everything is on and stable. And the fact that when you're inside the safe, you have a positive air gap security that does protect the desktop from the network equipment. And this then, if you can combine this together, gives you the ability of having the user having access to the network but not the network equipment. Now, here's an example. Have one out on the floor. You can stop by and see it if you like. Steel. You're not going to be drilling these things. You got to blast your way in. You need a plasma torch or something bigger than a 50 caliber armor-piercing shell to break into it. So that's not the threat vector. Go back to the threat. It's the insider, isn't it? And the insider is the guy who already knows the combo to the safe. Or if they're an outsider and they can surreptitiously find out what the combination is, they're just like an insider. So therefore, you have to assume they know the combo to the safe, and you have to be able to do something that allows you to react to that. So what you want to do is you want to monitor not only the environment. If it overheats, you want to protect that network equipment, but you want to protect access to it. And the way you do that is you monitor the door position just like a skiff would. You monitor the lock status. Now, one of the unfortunate things about the design of what started out as the XO 7, 8, 9, and now 10, and soon to be 11 locks that everybody knows and loves, the problem with it is the only way you can activate the lock is you have to turn the spin dial. So just closing the door to the safe doesn't secure anything, just closes the door. And you have to turn the spin dial to activate the lock. And when I talk to security officers time and time again, and I say, well, is this a real problem? Oh, yeah, it's a real problem. It's all the time. Some pay 20, 30, 50. Nope, it happens. People just close the safe and they forget to turn the spin dial. So it's a human frailty or something they ignore. They aren't disciplined enough to control. That creates a problem. So you want to be able to monitor the lock status. And the last thing is, if you monitor the rotation of the dial, so that if someone just turns the spin dial, they become a threat. Why is that the case? Well, with the desktop authentication, the user never has to get into the safe. He's theoretically, in fact, you don't even have to give him the combo anymore. He's not a threat. The threat is either the network tech or the guy who knows the combo who's trying to break in, or a bad guy. And they could be one of the same. And so the whole idea is that if you can monitor the spin dial, that we don't care whether they know the combo or not. We don't care who it is or not. The fact that they're turning that spin dial means they're trying to break into the safe. And that becomes a threat vector. So that if you can remotely monitor these signals, say either from a knock or from a guard station, where you can have a dashboard that will tell you green, red, one is for the lock, one's for the door, and you can be able to detect, and the dial rotation. You now can detect whether there's something potentially that's a threat. And you can monitor it from the knock. So you could build it into your performance monitoring software tools that you already have, like from SolarWinds or Spectrum or OpenView, that monitors the network activity anyway. So it's integrated in with the network monitoring that's already being done. And then what happens is if you do have an alert, it can do two things. The knock is immediately alerted. First of all, you have a continuous monitor, which is becoming much more important. They don't want people going around patrolling looking for locks that are open or closed or PDS that may be compromised. They want a continuous monitor of the network. And this is one way of doing it. The second thing is that when an alert goes out, you can then alert the knock as well as the guard shack. So you can get the cavalry out when you need to, but they have 10 to 15 minutes to respond to a threat. That's written into the code. So a lot can happen, particularly with an insider who knows he's got 10 minutes to play. You can do a lot of damage. So with using this Snmp trap protocol, which is a simple network management protocol, it basically is an on-off signal that just says, hey, there's an alert. It's just an alarm signal. It's what you do with it that counts. And what you do with it is this. Because it's a smart PDU, the dispatch center or the guard can immediately initiate a response to power everything down. So before anyone can even enter a combo to the safe, they can actually power everything off. The switch is off, no network connection, the laptop can be turned off, no access to the data, and the crypto gear can be turned off. And in fact, there are cases where through power management, you can even zeroize the crypto if it's in an overrun condition. So now you have the ability of literally controlling that endpoint and shutting it down if there's any potential threat. And that threat now has been restricted to an outsider threat, a network tech, or someone who's an insider who's trying to get at the network equipment itself. It's not the user access to the network. So you combine the two together. Here's just a visual of what it would look like. You can now have the ability of monitoring what's going on inside the safe. You can detect it either through a guard force or a network operations center. You can then have the ability to shut things off. And so now, when you have an IPS container that can meet the CCRI criteria for basically limiting user access to network equipment and also keeping the network on and running 24/7. So you have instant SIPRNet access. You don't have any antiviral rebooting or updates that you have to worry about. Everything's online and running. It takes that whole human equation out and makes it very simple and very manageable. You are securing the network, and you're not worried about the room. It is for online unattended operation, not offline storage. You have the ability of tying the security to the network, not the facility. And now the user has no hardware exposure. So it's limited in access. And you now have the remote ability to control that user interface. And so you can integrate the network physical security at the endpoint integrated with cybersecurity and physical security with proactive controls from all threats. Because the safe itself does provide you the kinetic protection, EMP protection. The OPSEC is improved because the user doesn't have to do as much. They're not as responsible for as much security-related activity. It's all automatic and all done for them. But using the IPS container with these built-in access controls in conjunction with cybersecurity give you this seamless network endpoint security. So that is my talk. Are there any questions? Anything I might have missed? Yes, sir.
Talked about only authorized users have access to network devices.
Mm-hmm.